Now what I want to do is I want to introduce rotating and scaling, and before I get into those commands, I'm going to select all of my objects and I'm going to erase them. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create two rectangles, so just really arbitrary rectangles. And again, I just right-clicked to redo the rectangle command for the second rectangle. And what I want to do is I want to type in RO for rotate. And rotate and scale tend to work the same in how you go through the steps with each one of those commands. So it's going to ask me to select objects, and I can either select one object or I can select both objects. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select both objects and hit enter. And then it's going to ask me to specify a base point. So basically what it needs is it needs to know about which point it's going to rotate. So in that case, and you know, when you start to work with Autocad, you'll get used to which base points you like to use. So it might be an endpoint, it might be a midpoint. You know, it really is up to you and how you start to work with the program. For this case, I'm going to use an endpoint, so I'm just going to snap it to the endpoint of the top rectangle. And my ortho is on, so you'll see that when I move my mouse, it constrains it to the 90 degrees. If I hit F8 and take that off, then what happens is I can arbitrarily rotate it, or it's leaving a dialog open so that I can actually enter the angle that I want as well. So if I type in 45, what it's going to do is it's going to snap it to the 45 degrees, okay, because I started off as, you know, essentially this was along the 0 line, and so now this is at 45 degrees because it's rotated it up 45 degrees according to the same coordinates that we had when we talked about this when we were creating lines to an angle. Okay, there's really not much more, you know, to that until we start to get into rotating by reference. But before we do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another rectangle and use the scale tool. And the alias for scale is SC, and hit enter. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to select my rectangle. Okay, and again, I can have either one object or more than one object. Hit enter. Specify my base point. So again, I'm going to choose the same base point. And then what I can do is I can either arbitrarily, okay, you'll see that when I move my mouse in and out, okay, and it's a little bit more difficult with your snaps. So if I turn them off, you can see, you should be able to see it a little bit better. Okay, so that's basically just arbitrarily scaling it, or what I can do is I can actually specify a scale factor. And so what that means is that if I want my object to be twice as big, I would type in 2. If I want it to be the same size, I would type in 1. If I want it half, I would type in 0.5. So that's essentially the scale factor that we're going to enter. So let's say I want it 3/4 of the size that it is now. I'm going to type in 0.75, and it's going to snap it to and scale it to 3/4 of the size that it was from that base point that we specified at first. Okay, so those are not, you know, too complicated when we get into those commands, but they also are a little bit more sophisticated than they seem to be. And what we're going to be doing is just learning how to rotate by reference and how to scale by reference. And you may not have a specific, you know, use for this just yet, but usually towards the end of the semester, when people have to start to do furniture plans and they need to rotate it, you know, to be parallel against a wall, rather than figuring out what the angle is, they'll actually just use the rotate or scale by reference because it takes the guesswork out of it. Okay, it's definitely a lazy man's type of command. So what we're going to do is I'm going to start by rotating by reference, and I'm just going to create an arbitrary line. Okay, and what I want to do is basically I want this line to end up at the same angle as this. Okay, without having to do any math, without having to figure out what that's going to be. And I'm going to use the rotating by reference. So I'm going to type in RO for rotate. I'm going to select the objects that I want to rotate. So I'm only going to select this object. And I can do multiple. So as long as all your objects are selected, you can hit enter. And that's going to bring you back into the command to specify the base point. So I'm going to specify my base point I'm going to make sure that my F3, my object snap, is on and snap to this endpoint. Okay, and so we've already done the command up to this point. Now, rather than doing what we did before, if you look in the sub options, okay, I'm going to use this reference sub option. So I'm going to type in R for reference. And what it's asking me is to specify the reference angle. So it's saying what is the reference angle that you want to use. So that's going to be the angle that you're referencing on your object. Okay, so it's a little bit difficult in how it words things, but once you know the sequence of things, it's easy. So basically it's asking me to specify the reference angle. So I'm going to click on one endpoint and another to specify that reference, and then it's going to ask me to specify the new angle. And I can either specify, you know, if I want this edge to be 45 degrees, I can type in 45 degrees. Okay, or 30 degrees or 60 degrees, whatever you want it to be. I can type that in, and what that is, it's going to make that 60 degrees. Or what I can do is if I look, there's another option for points. Okay, and this is the example that we're going to do because I have this arbitrary line that I want to match it up with. I want this edge to match up with this edge. So I'm going to type in P for points, and I'm going to specify the first point on the resultant line and a second point. And what it does is if I move my object up, you'll see that it actually made that edge the same angle as that. So it's very helpful in that. We can also do the same thing when we scale by reference too as well. So I'm going to make a line. And this one I'm going to turn my ortho on. And, you know, again, what this allows for is for you to be a little bit more freer when you start to design, because you're not as, you know, constrained with specific dimensions and specific angles, and trying to get other things to match up with it. So, you know, it takes the guesswork out of that too as well. So now what I want to do is I want to type in SC for scale. I'm going to select my object, hit enter, specify my base point, same thing as I did before, and I can either specify the scale factor that we did earlier, or I can type in R for reference. Okay, so just like rotating by reference, I'm going to specify my reference length. So I want this edge to be the same scale as this line. So I'm going to specify one endpoint and two endpoints on that scale, on that rectangle. And then I can either say, if I know that it needs to be a specific dimension, say 2 feet, I can type in 2 feet and it will make this edge 2 feet and scale everything according to that. Or if I don't know what distance I want it to be, okay, or what length I want it to be, but I know that I want it to be the length of this line, the same length, I'm going to type in P again for points, specify an endpoint on this line and the other endpoint, and now when I move these, you know, just close to each other, you'll see that they're the same scale, okay, and they're the same length. So that's the great thing behind the scaling by reference and rotating by reference. Now what I want to show you is the explode tool, okay, and to do that I'm going to erase this line and these objects and focus on this rectangle. So whether we have a rectangle or a singular polyline, what we can actually do is we can actually explode it into lines. And there, you know, there's a time and a place for everything, and there are times when we do want to explode this object into segments. So to do that, we're going to use the explode command. What it does is it explodes into different segments. So if I type in EX and go down to explode, okay, I'm going to select my object and hit enter. Okay, the alias for that is also X. And what it did is that now you'll see that they're separate objects. Okay, not the same rectangle that it was before. Now what I want to do, after there are times when, you know, I do have a series of line segments, and say for example I want to offset this whole thing, but I don't want to offset it in line segments as I would have to do, you know, if it was exploded. So what I want to do is I want to turn this back into a continuous polyline. So I'm going to type in PEDIT, which is P-edit. It also stands for polyline edit. Okay, And I'm going to hit enter, and it's going to ask me to select a polyline. So I'm going to select just one polyline. And do I want to turn it into 1? I'm going to say enter, which is yes, and that's the default. And then it's going to give me options. And what I want to do is I want to choose join, okay? Or you can type in J from the menu down here if you don't work with this dynamic input. And then I'm just going to select all of the objects, hit enter, and then hit enter to get out of it again, because you can do this forever and ever and ever until you just hit enter to get out of that. And now you'll see that it's turned back into one object.